screen recording? And
It's recording.
All right, cool.
Okay.
So we're good to go.
Thank you.
If we can get, Copilot GitHub, is that an available model to use?
So, what they have right now is OpenAI.
Hi everybody, this is Jen, and she will talk the unique challenges of design system at scale.
Hey everybody. So just a couple notes before I begin. The first note is that this is going to be a compressed presentation, so it's going to be about a half hour, so that way we can get this room set up for lunch, which will be amazing because then we'll have a nice place to sit down and eat lunch. So I know on the schedule it said I think 15 minutes, but we're going to get it down a little bit. In that case, I took some slides out, and so hopefully I'll remember that I take those slides out and that I'll be able to do this correctly.
Jen,
Yes.
can you take the mic with you if
Oh, yeah,
since
yeah,
it's on the
sorry.
recording if you're gonna?
Yeah. I'm going to do this.
It's not working.
Oh, is it not working?
It doesn't have amplification, but it records into the recording.
Oh.
Or it's supposed to at least.
Okay.
It's off.
Okay, I'll talk loud and clear. Hopefully it's not like super loud for the recording. So my name is Jen Wachowski. I'm an associate design director at Lullabot. I currently live in Buffalo, New York, which is right over the border in the United States. I did not drive here today because I did not want to deal with the QEW, so I came in yesterday. And I love the outdoors, so it's a great area to do some hiking, camping, especially this type of year when it's fall and the leaves are changing. So here's the backstory of how this talk came about. And so I had just come off a project where I've spent 3.5 years working closely with the Carbon design system. And if you're not familiar with Carbon, it's an open source design system that is managed by IBM. And within IBM, it touches everything. So it touches marketing, it touches documentation, it touches their internal tools, social media. Its breadth is gigantic, but the core of itself is very, very small. So during my tenure, I experienced Carbon and working with the design system as an adopter, contributor, and a consultant. And I thought it was unique that I got to experience all three of those. I learned a lot. And I also helped manage a temporary design system where I helped create and governance, and contribution models. And while I was doing this, I also worked closely with the core design system library teams to help shape future components. To say I learned a lot is definitely an understatement. I worked with some really smart, experienced design system designers and developers, and I wanted to share what I had learned when I had rolled off that project. And when I was thinking about how I could share this, I did some research. And there was like a lot of talks and articles out there about how to best set up design systems. Right now, it's a lot of design systems and AI. But there isn't really anything out there that I found that really talked about the challenges of setting up a design system. Things you should plan for before you even start beginning, especially when you're scaling a design system and predicting the future of how that design system is going to scale. And here's why that's important. So I had mentioned that I had managed a temporary design system while I was working as a vendor for IBM. And this design system was created for a single product marketing website. So it had unique business goals, it had unique user needs, and so the design system was formed around that. But what ended up happening is everybody loved it so much that they decided that they wanted to use it for the majority of their product marketing websites, which was over 100. So as you can imagine, because we did not plan for this to scale the way that it did, things went really wrong. The first thing that went wrong is that this design system exploded to over 65 components. And you may say, well, that's not too large. But the way that it was set up, it was really hard to contribute back to. So what ended up happening is we had almost duplicate components within the system itself with like small variations. And it got confusing for content authors and developers to know when to use what. And so what ended up happening is people tried to contribute to it, and it was an awful experience. Also, I felt really bad for our developers because it was a nightmare to maintain. And at the end, I kind of felt like this guy here. I felt like I was putting out fires left and right, and I realized that I really didn't have the right tools. And the reason why I didn't really have the right tools is because we didn't plan for this to scale in the way that it did, and because of it, it created a mess for us to deal with. So hence the reason why I'm talking about it right now. So that's the story of how this came about, and here's what I plan to cover based on my experience. So I'm going to talk about challenges with design patterns at scale. And when I talk about design patterns, these are the actual components that the system is made out of. Maintaining a system of systems at scale. Naming systems at scale. This one is going to be a goodie. I love talking about naming. Everybody has different ideas about naming. And finally, content flexibility at scale. Just a heads up, I am not a content strategist. I don't even play one on TV. But there are some things as systems designers that I think that we can watch out for. Another note is that I am not going to get into code. I know a little bit of front-end development, but not enough to talk to front-end developers where I sound like I know what I'm talking about. So this is mostly a design talk. And so for the purpose of the talk, when I mention a design system at scale, what I don't mean is that the design system is large and has over 90 plus components. That's something we want to avoid, right? Based on my experience. What I do mean is that the design system has to scale beyond a single type of need or use case and services many types of applications, maybe across the company. And each of this application has its own purpose, unique user needs, business requirements, and this typically happens in large companies. So I made a handy diagram to describe this. So we have our design system that sits at the top, and it has to feed down into product, marketing, documentation, maybe a content management system, maybe a point of sale or customer relation management tool. And then some of these could have subcomponents. So we have under product, maybe it has a sub-library for web, and then another library for native application. So let's dive into details and start with design patterns at scale. So the first big challenge is managing the conflict between flexibility and consistency when it comes to expanding component features and the system itself. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to use a card component. I have a love-hate relationship with the card component. I try to love cards, but it just never loves me back. So Nathan Curtis had a great example of cards got out of control in a talk he gave at a conference a few years back called Schema. I've added a link to his talk at the end of this presentation. Highly recommend you check it out. It's kind of comical how quickly his Figma file gets out of control with variants. So say you have a basic card component, and we're going to give it a container and an option for an image and some headline text, and this works okay for a while, but as adoption spans, so does this card. And then so team A comes over to you, and they're like, hey, we want a subtitle in an area for body copy. And you're like, yeah, okay, you know what, that's a reasonable request. Why don't we include that in the very beginning? So, you go ahead and you create the variation and you call it variation A. More about how this name is such an awful name later on in this presentation. So this works out for a while, but then team B comes to you and see that large image doesn't work for them. They need a thumbnail image and they want the option to align it left or right. So you're like, okay, we'll give you that thumbnail image, and you name it variation B. Well, then team C comes to you and they want to use a logo. But see, logos come in all shapes and sizes, and that thumbnail image doesn't work because it's a fixed size. So you think about, maybe we should go back and, change variation B. But then all these teams are using variation B, so there might be some regression, some weird things that happen. You have to communicate out to all these other teams. So you just create the new variation, and you call it variation C. And then team D comes to you, and they need a pricing card with all these different features, and at this point, you're pulling your hair out, right? Because this super simple card has become super complex. How does this happen? Well, one reason is we don't want teams to go rogue and actually, start creating their own components, right? We want them to adopt the system. But we also don't want to create so much flexibility that it becomes difficult to maintain either. So what can we do? So we have to think about the way we approach and structure the system in a way by simplifying features where necessary. Does this mean not giving all the adopters the features that they need? Absolutely not. Like, we want them to adopt the system. So in his talk, Nathan Curtis suggested breaking the system down into smaller subcomponents. So, for example, instead of providing a card with all the features, just provide a base card and then provide documentation and guardrails for how teams can use that base card. So this empowers teams to build the types of cards that they need using the base system and doesn't overcomplicate things. So a base card could just be a background color or a container, and then the system provides documentation for how the base card can handle things like imagery, iconography, typography, background colors, therefore providing all the pieces that teams need to assemble their cards. So in fact, we could interchange flexibility versus consistency with efficiency versus expansion. So there's always going to be this tension around trying to keep the design system sleek and efficient versus expanding the design system while in turn making it more complex. So keeping it small and efficient can also help keep components more consistent, while expanding the system adds more of that flexibility, but can also introduce that inconsistency. So finding the right balance and determining when and how to expand the system can be challenging. It's very hard to find where that tipping point is. So encouraging teams to build pattern libraries off the base or core level system can help alleviate some of those challenges. For example, you have your core design system that sits at the top. Team A can create their product library from it. Team B can create their marketing library. Team C their documentation library, etc. And then some of these might have those sub-libraries again. So a product library might feed into a web library and also a native app library. So the advantages of using pattern libraries include less maintenance. So it puts ownership on the specific teams to maintain, document, and create consistency around governance and contribution models. They're also easier to update, so components are simplified, less to maintain. There's more control. Components at the base level feed into those pattern libraries. And then finally, validation. Having teams test components before consider adding them up to the base library. So there might be some components that teams are using that other teams might want to use too. So you can have them test to see engagement, flexibility, before contributing those up the chain. So next, let's talk about maintaining a system of systems. So what exactly is a system of systems? Well, there's a lot that a design system has to do. So a typical design system includes brand elements, components, guidance for content, UX, documentation, the list can go on. But one small change can affect all of that. So as the system gets larger and more teams are adopting the system, it's more of a challenge to maintain one big set. So you want to kind of think of it as like the cruise ship analogy. So a cruise ship is so large, it's really hard to stop or turn quickly, and the same with the design system. So the larger the design system gets, the longer or more difficult it's going to take for it to pivot. So what if we didn't have one large system, but a subset of smaller systems that make up the whole? So this approach has been called decentralization and can help distribute some of that ownership to other teams. So there's a great article by Oscar Gonzalez about decentralization. And I added a link to it at the end of this presentation. So he mentions the key lies in abandoning centralized, the key lies not in abandoning centralized control entirely, but thoughtfully redistributing responsibility and decision-making power across the network. So basically, we're taking one large system and breaking it down into smaller chunks. So these chunks should be treated separately, each having their own set of files and tools. These four chunks are brand, base components, pattern libraries, and templates. So each feeding into each other down the chain. So we have brand feeding into base components feeding into pattern libraries, and pattern libraries feeding into templates. And brand and base tend to be owned by centralized teams, where pattern libraries tend to be owned by product teams. So brand is the highest level. So it contains all the styles and foundations that form a specific look and feel for the site. They tend to be shared company-wide. So these are things like your colors, typography, image illustration guidelines, etc. So brand is the highest level, which means it typically gets ingested into everything that's created for the system. Because of this, it's also the most difficult to contribute back to because it affects all different types of assets that the company creates. So next, we have our base components. I call these the core level. They are the set of small atoms and molecules that inherit styles from brand. Carbon has under 45. I'm going to say that again. Carbon has under 45 compared to the 60 plus that we had. So they also provide the high-level guidance for layout, spacing, accessibility, theming, and use cases. The governance process isn't as strict, but there should be an open, established process for others to contribute to as user-wise. Pattern libraries are the most flexible. So these are the libraries that are assembled by other teams based on their needs. All the patterns that are assembled using base components and inherent styles and guides from brand. What's great about this library is that it allows other teams to govern and have their own set of maintainers, which takes time, pressure, and work off the base component team. And often, when a pattern library is being built out or expanded, the team will seek feedback from the base component team, and sometimes brand, depending if they're working on things like gradients, that they think that others might want to use. So templates are the end result of everybody's hard work in the previous level. I call these the builder level. They are the skeletons for all the components and the different ways that they can be assembled. So they are the set of page layouts that use components from pattern libraries to assemble a page. And typically, a team that's creating the set of templates looks to the pattern library team for guidance and help identify new components that they may need to include down the road. So these are the people that are on the ground level building the pages, and because of that, they can more easily identify bugs or variants that are needed and communicate that up the chain. So you may be thinking to yourself, solve seems great, right? Like, if we implement this, we won't run into any challenges, right? Unfortunately, that is untrue. One of the biggest challenges is, at least for me, documenting for future knowledge. Like, why was this component rejected? Why did we use this color instead of that color? Why did we change this font size here? 2 months down the road, or in my case, 2 days later, you might not remember the answer to any of these questions. But decision documentation is hard to keep up with because it's not a priority, right? So we like to focus on the work and not the documentation. And sometimes when things get busy, documentation kind of gets dropped. The other challenge is encouraging contribution, especially on the highest levels. So if you're contributing something back to brand, you're probably going to be in a meeting with like 5 executive vice presidents of creative who you've never met before, and they're all critiquing your work. And that's scary, at least for me. It induces a bunch of anxiety, and I'm going to spend days prepping for this. And a lot of time, people don't have the time to contribute to that type of process. So they just live with what they have. They live with the colors and typography that they have, and don't contribute back up to brand. So moving on to my favorite, naming. So this is a really popular quote. There are only 2 hard things in computer science: cache and validation and naming things, by Phil Carlton. I'm sure we're all aware of this quote. So I'm going to talk about some of these naming challenges. So as the design system grows, the elements within the design system will change. They definitely will, in my experience. So how do we name things in a way where it can accurately describe the component as it changes in the future? So for example, let's take our component here that we had called announcement banner. It's supposed to be used for announcements, so that's why we called it announcement banner. So we have a headline, some body text, and a hyperlink. The use cases came up, and we added an image down the line, some tags, some pricing, and now looking at this name, it's not really an announcement banner anymore. It's like a pricing card, right? So here's another great example. I was talking with one of my coworkers, and they were creating a new hero component. and they named it 50/50 Hero because the image takes up 50% of the space and the text takes up 50% of the space. So they go to the front-end development team with this component, and guess what? It's responsive, so at certain screen sizes, technically it's not 50/50. It's more like 30/70. And so they decide to come up with a different name, and they name it Container Hero because the image is in a container and the text is in the container. And I know some of you are laughing now because you know what's going to happen. They go to content management system developers, and they're like, guess what? Don't use the word container ever. And so now everybody's brains melted because naming is hard. So you may be thinking to yourself, like, well, why didn't everybody get into a room and talk about and hash out these names? Well, there can be some really big barriers to doing that. Time is one of those barriers. The other thing is, like, people don't want to spend time naming. If you put a meeting on the calendar, like 3-hour, let's get together and hash out some names for components, guess what? People might be busy. So this is a great article by PJ and Nori. The title of this article is Naming Things in Design Systems and Why It's the Worst. I also put a link to this article at the end of my presentation. With the title of that, I had to read it, right? Because I felt the same way. And this is actually the first sentence of his article. So I highly recommend you check it out. It's actually quite comical and speaks the truth about naming. So let's talk about some of those challenges. So how do you foresee the future and make the name descriptive enough, allows for change and growth? It didn't work out so well for our announcement banner, right? Like, should we have named it a little bit something less specific, like content block short? But then, what the heck is a content block short, right? Like, that's a little too obscure. So you also want to find a naming system that can be shared throughout the process of design and development. Especially now, Figma has a lot of new features. We can actually name design tokens in Figma and export them out for development. So it should definitely be a conversation between the two teams to make sure that you guys are on alignment on like what types of names should be, names should be included with tokens. So one thing is for certain, when stuff gets pushed out in production, if you want to rename things, guess what? You're going to get a big fat bill. At least that's what happened to me. Because it's challenging, right? Things are live. You can't rename things when they're live. So when Figma released their new variables feature, probably a couple years ago now, they mentioned an approach to naming that I found interesting at the time, and I'm going to share it. This may be old news for some, new news for others. So at the base level, they encourage the word primitive. You would have your base styles. So these are names based on values. So you have like your blue 20, blue 30, blue 40. The next level is the semantic level, which is inherited from the primitive level. And these components and styles are named based on intention. So you have things like your text button, border strong, background success. And then finally, you have your component level, which is inherited from the semantic level. And like the name implies, these have semantic specific names like button small, button hover, button primary. There's another great approach out there coined by Nathan Curtis when naming design tokens. And again, I'm putting links of all of these at the end as references. So basically, the name has a specific structure that aligns to taxonomy and typology of the design system elements. For example, a simple token like here at the top could use system, category, color, variant, where a more complex token can introduce more categories like system, category, concept, property, and variant. So in his article, he says to be sufficiently descriptive, a tokenized language that incorporates both taxonomy and typology needs many levels. And many of these levels can fall into categories to help give the token more structure as naming becomes more specific and complex. And these categories are namespace, object, base, and modifier. So next, let's talk about challenges with content at scale. Before I dive deep into challenges, though, I just want to point out an example that showcases one of the bigger things we fear as systems designers. So let's take our old buddy again, the card component. We have a big image, we have title, we have some paragraph text, we could even add some tags, but what is this card in the middle that has like 3 paragraphs of text? Like, at least for me, I don't design cards to have paragraphs of text. So this is how I feel when I see something like that. I'm like, no, you cannot use it like that. So this monstrosity of a card is actually a result of several challenges with content flexibility within the system. So the system can do a pretty good job around content guidance if the end result of how it's being used is limited. For example, 1 or 2 use cases. But as the system scales and more sites and teams start using these components, it becomes more difficult to maintain that flexibility. And that's how you end up with a card with 3+ paragraphs. Also, what I've learned over and over again is teams will often test the limitations of the types of content a component is designed for, or how much recommended content the actual component should hold. Hence, you get a tag that wraps to 3 lines. I've actually seen this in the wild, and I am kicking myself for not taking a screenshot, so I tried to recreate it. But yeah, I'm like, no, that's not how you use a tag. So you must be thinking, but wait, we can solve this problem with documentation around content guidance, or maybe truncate the content. Yes, we could, but these come with this own set of challenges. So let's start with content guidance. So you have to expect the worst case scenario where maybe 75% of authors won't read it, and that's if you're lucky. So I get this almost like maybe once or twice a week where somebody chats me and it's like, hey, what's the character count for this component? Or like, hey, what's the image ratio size for this component? And I'm like, hey, did you read the documentation? And they're like, yeah, it's not in there. Yes, it's in the documentation. So, okay, so what about modifying the component when it reaches a certain character count? So a few examples of this is like truncate the content, or have the component actually break or shift when the content goes beyond the recommended max. Well, I've worked on projects where this was implemented before, and I've actually learned that like people will launch with broken components because it doesn't look broke to them, right? They don't know what a broken component is supposed to look like. So it's okay if like a CTA appears in the middle of an image where it's not supposed to be there. So why don't we just make the component super flexible and make it do all the things, right? Well, that is not a great solution either because there's no guardrails, right? And if there's no guardrails, it becomes a maintenance overhead, and you might have somebody actually launch with everything turned on, right? So, which can happen. So finally, I leave you this quote. This is a great quote by James Clear, who is an author on creating good habits. Some lessons have to be experienced to be learned. However it goes, good or bad, take the lessons you've learned and apply them to your next design systems plan. So this is a list of resources that I mentioned throughout this presentation. A few to point out that I highly recommend you check out. Naming things in design systems and why it's the worst. That is a goodie. And then architecting subcomponents and naming design tokens and design systems. Those are the ones by Nathan Curtis. And if you're not sure who Nathan Curtis is, he is a designer, front-end developer whose expertise is in design systems and releases a lot of great articles on setting up and implementing design systems. So, thank you for having me. If you want to reach out, I have LinkedIn and I have an email address. That's as far as I go with social media. And I think we have time for questions, maybe like a couple minutes before the room gets broken down and set up a table. So, do you have any questions?
The card one.
Yes.
Like everyone has that. So how do you get your 5 variations or your 10 variations or however many you need so that people aren't doing the crazy example you showed in the last? Like, how do you break that down?
So that is an interesting question. So the question is like, how do you get all your variations without it getting super complex? And so in the past, at least with the teams that I've worked on, we've tried to figure out like, where does it make sense to make a new card component, right? So when that pricing card came along at the end, it might be time to actually think about the pricing card component versus like a article or a promotion card component, right? And each offers different types of variants, so that way you don't have a single card that is trying to do everything. And it also creates guardrails for use cases, right? So like a pricing card obviously would be used for pricing, where a content or promotion card may be used to promote a service or promote a blog article. So.
Creating use case documentation for word counts, all of that in the example that you outlined was, it gets lost.
Yeah.
And they always get lost, is sort of been my experience. Do you have any thoughts on approaches to first of all, there's the layer of someone implementing that component into a CMS or whatever, but then there's the end users using the component, so it's almost like there's different layers of rules that need to be communicated to different people. Do you have any thoughts on the best way to keep it so people actually read the rules?
Yeah, so the question is, what are some suggestions for best way to read the rules so the documentation doesn't get lost? So there's a couple things that we have experimented with over the last couple of years. The first thing is, if people are presented a wall of text, they're not going to read it. And so one of the things that we have tried to introduce is visuals, so do's and don'ts, but actually visually showing do this, don't do this. So they can see what we're trying to go for is we want something that looks like this, not like this. The other thing is actually taking some of that content guidance and introducing it into the content management system itself. And so, having labels 130, recommended 130 characters max. Again, unless you have hard guidelines where they are typing and it is literally 130 characters max and that is it. The problem with doing that though is you might have some special use cases that you want to give exceptions to, who might want it 150, and you're well, that doesn't look as awful, so you want to be able to grant that 150 character count. So that's why it's kind of hard to have that recommended stop and actually implement that from a code perspective, so they only can put in 130 characters, because there might be use cases that come up down the line where and we might want to have an exception for just this one team. So,
In terms of resourcing an enterprise design system, we're looking to build something that's pretty analogous to Carbon. What would you say would be the minimum, trying to resource this in a lean way, the minimum roles that you would think would still result in a successful implementation?
So that is a great question. I think you definitely need a designer who might be able to straddle the UX and research side of things too. So if you can find somebody who has skills in all three of that, that's one person. You also need a front-end developer right off the bat to help provide feedback, especially with naming, design tokens. And I think it also depends on how you plan on setting up your system. So if you're going to use some of the tools in Figma, their new their MCP server, Code Connect, that type of things, you definitely want to get the developer in earlier than later, and not do the designer work on the things and then they hand it off to the developer. It should be a collaborative process. And I think you probably need somebody to manage it, like a product owner. And I think you can start off that's your team starting off. So. Any other questions? Well, thank you. Let's clap.